Hello and welcome to another edition of the CBS News Battleground Briefing. I'm CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, joined by CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. We meet again because while there's been a lot of attention paid to the early voting states like Iowa and New Hampshire, in some ways the most consequential day of the Democratic primary race will be, of course, Super Tuesday, when voters in 14 states make their voices heard. Why, remind us, Anthony, is this day so important on the Democratic primary calendar?
Well, first of all, it's the biggest delegate haul that's out there. Those early states are really about who we in the media choose to pay attention to, right? A candidate stands up there on a stage and says, I won in Iowa and New Hampshire. But half of the people in these Super Tuesday states say that they will look to the early contests like Iowa and New Hampshire to help them winnow the field, to help them see who the most viable candidates are. So, back to this idea of Mike Bloomberg getting in. He's getting in and saying he wants to play in the Super Tuesday states. Does he shake up the race? Well, at this moment, he's in 5th place. The top tier is still up there. It's Joe Biden, it's Elizabeth Warren, it's Bernie Sanders. But Bloomberg, I think, is hoping that he can go through those Super Tuesday states, maybe coming after those early ones, and maybe take advantage of if the Democrats aren't satisfied with their field at that point.
So right now we have Biden in the lead, followed by who?
Followed by Elizabeth Warren, and then Bernie Sanders, who's got really strong support, and then Pete Buttigieg at 9%, and then Bloomberg coming in, starting early, at the 4%. What is interesting about Bloomberg, Ed, is that you see people look at him, and if you are more liberal, especially the very liberal, they say, okay, he's spending all this money on his campaign. They take that as, well, it's rich people trying to have too much influence in politics. But the more moderate side of the party looks at that spending and says, oh, he's independent from big donors. And there's a really stark difference there, and that's, of course, the second part of that is, of course, what he's trying to communicate.
One of the other things you found is likability, and somebody that people might not suspect is actually sitting on top as the most liked Democratic contender.
Yeah, that's Elizabeth Warren. We've known that she's liked for her specifics. We've known that she's liked for her policies. She's also liked for her personal qualities, right? So that could be a really strong point in her favor going forward. Biden is also well liked. The newer entrants, Mike Bloomberg, not as much. It's about half and half, but a lot of people don't know who he is yet. So that likability factor could come into play as we go forward.
And one of the factors for Bloomberg I thought was interesting, you discovered that many Democratic voters don't actually realize that he had been a big supporter of Democratic causes, things like gun control and climate change.
That's right. And I mean, I think you've seen the ads, folks have seen the ads, a lot of people have seen the ads. In fact, they tell us that they think the ads were memorable, so that's getting through. But the message of that, which is that point, that he's trying to say he supported Democratic causes in the past, there's half of Democrats don't know that yet. So if you're looking for whether or not he can actually play in this, that might be your leading indicator.
Yeah, it was striking. On Friday, he held an event in Alexandria, Virginia, just across the river from Washington. Had about maybe 80 to 100 people there, which is one of his larger crowds so far, 3 weeks in. What he keeps doing in these events he's been holding across the country is essentially reconvening groups of people he's met with in the past on gun control when he was in Aurora, Colorado, or with mayors who went through his mayoral training program at Harvard. And in the case of the event in Virginia, on climate change, there's a massive coal plant that sits right there on the Potomac River that he helped fund the closure of it and brought a bunch of activists together to talk about that again. So he's sort of reminding voters as he goes, if you don't think I'm a reliable Democrat, remember that I've helped bankroll all these different programs to try to implement your biggest policy proposals. And it was striking. There were Joe Biden supporters in this crowd. There were Elizabeth Warren supporters in this crowd. Most of them had been tipped off by the local Democratic committee that he was there, because I guess he'd called ahead and said, I'll be holding this event at a restaurant, show up. But many were members of the Sierra Club and some other organizations that he's essentially written big checks to over the years, basically showing up to say thank you. So whether he can expand beyond those groups he's worked with will be key to whether or not he has any real viability. One other thing I thought was interesting in this poll, you checked in on the issue of taxes, because obviously with these ambitious plans that so many contenders are talking about, they have to be paid for somehow. And voters basically concede, yes, taxes might go up.
Yeah. Especially in a relative way, for People think Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders' policies might end up raising their taxes. Now, I should emphasize, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not considering voting for them. In fact, a lot of people who are considering voting for them think that their taxes will go up. But, you know, in a relative way anyway, Joe Biden less likely to be seen as someone who's going to have your taxes go up. And remember, because Democrats support these policies, the argument does eventually get through that that might be how they have to pay for them. You know, so it's not necessarily just raise your taxes, therefore not vote.
Let me ask you one final one. We didn't prep for this, but I know it's on your mind. Because there's been this ongoing debate among Democrats about how they should put together their debate stages. And there's been so much emphasis placed on polling. It seems to me the DNC didn't potentially bank on the idea that you and your colleagues in the polling world wouldn't necessarily be polling on a frequent basis in ways that would help them determine the debate stage. Because I've heard from some campaigns even just this month who say, where are the polls? Why haven't they been done? Nobody's been really doing a straight horse race number in ways that helps us. Did you guys ever get a call from the DNC or from the campaigns about how often will you be polling? Or is that something that our debate rules, will you factor that into how often you do it?
I think that we poll, and we should poll, based on where the news is. And that's what drives our polling. So if we're going to go poll in Iowa, it's because we want to check in on the campaign in Iowa. If we're going to check in on the Super Tuesday states like we're doing this week, it's because there's been a couple of late entrants, and we want to see what happens in those states, right, that big delegate haul. Because it's, for the news polling, in my view, has always been, we're trying to explain the race to people. We're trying to tell Americans what their fellow Americans want. Whether or not a party decides to use polling or fundraising, as they also do, to qualify for their debate stage is up to them. You know, I mean, if the information is out there and we can present it in a clear and accurate way, that's all good. But how they use it, that's up to them.
And it's fair to say this has been the most poll-driven debate schedule or debate process, at least for Democrats in recent history?
Well, we're certainly doing more polling than we've ever done, but I think that's important, especially because, if you don't do polling, then whatever the campaigns say goes unchecked, right? You've got to see whether or not it's registering or whether it's getting through. Whether or not people ought to use polling to qualify for a debate stage, a lot of pollsters look at that and we say, well, okay, we get it. You want to see if a campaign is resonating. Fine. But you also have to remember that some of these cutoffs, 2%, 5%, whichever one you make it, there's margins of error on these. And so, you have to realize that just because somebody is at one particular percent doesn't mean A, that can't move, and B, that within the margin of error, that can't be a little bit different.
Well, you can see the full results of Anthony's latest survey, our latest survey, at cbsnews.com. Thanks for watching. I'm Ed O'Keefe with Anthony Salvanto. We'll see you next time.